Computers. This is actually the most confusing thing about selecting the right computer hardware for you to use in your animation studio. So there's one thing that you should know. What computer is good for you is actually a very confusing question. But I'm going to give you a formula so that you can simplify the confusion, but there's still going to be a very, very big confusion. So what computer hardware is good for you is actually dependent upon your workflow. So I'm going to say what computer is good for this workflow that I actually teach in this course. So in this course, we're going to use a lot of different softwares. We're going to use softwares like Blender. Mainly, we're going to use Blender and Adobe softwares. So the main difference between Blender and Adobe softwares is actually very simple. Blender is a, what do you call it? CPU? Processor? Oh my god, I keep on forgetting these names. So Blender is a processor heavy software. So if you're to use Blender, you had to, Blender alone, you had to make sure that you get the computer with the best processor out there. And that's if you can afford it. So let's say you are placed with two choices. You have one computer with an Intel iCore i7, which is actually faster than Intel iCore i3. So you have one iCore i3 and another iCore i7. If you are a Blender user, then I'll highly recommend that you go with the one with a much faster processor. But then the other things that will come, and then you start confusing with things like multi-threading, overclocking. They're very confusing. So I'm just generalizing this. So by me generalizing this, it's actually I'm also committing a crime, because I'm not supposed to generalize this. But the general rule is that Blender is a processor-intensive software. Adobe products, on the other hand, they are RAM-intensive. So if you have if you have a workflow of Adobe softwares, I'll highly recommend you get more RAM. But this is my experience. I have two computers right now using this very animation studio, and one of them has a RAM of 8 gigabytes and the other has a RAM of 4 gigabytes. When I render the same file in both computers, they render at the exactly same speed. Why? Because they both have the same processors. And once you do the rendering process, if you go to the Windows Task Manager, you can actually see how much RAM a certain software is utilizing. When I render with softwares like After Effects, Adobe products, I always see that they're using more RAM. When I'm rendering with Adobe, perhaps it can use up to 5 GB of RAM, and that's because I've actually gone into the settings of Adobe After Effects and made sure that they don't use more than 5 gigabytes of RAM. But they won't use that. Maybe they'll use 70, sometimes even 80 or 90% of the processor, but the RAM will make a big difference in Adobe products. But when it comes to Blender, the processor actually makes the biggest difference. So if the processor makes the biggest difference, you can have a computer with 64 gigabytes of RAM, but let's say an iCore i3, an i3 processor, and those 64 gigabytes of RAM won't make a big difference. Yes, you can have graphics cards. Of course, graphics card usually they usually render faster. But then there's one problem: they cannot render complex scenes. So you actually get more value if you invest in good processor rather than investing in very expensive $600 graphics card. For both my computers, I have actually very cheap graphics card. In fact, I pulled out one of them from my other computer. I cannot pull that from this other computer because it's very fragile. I have this thing, I think if I pull out the graphics card, I'll jinx the computer. So this is the graphics card that I'm using. It's actually very cheap. Yes, and it actually renders even fast. It renders 2 times faster than my processor. But 90% of the time, I can't use this, because 90% of the time, I'll have complex scenes that will be unable to render with a graphics card. So Blender is a processor-intensive software. Get the best processor you can for your money. That's it. The RAM, it doesn't matter. It does matter, of course. You shouldn't have very little RAM. RAM, I would suggest going up, somewhere around 8 GB. And also, some people will be like, 8 GB, that's very little. Of course, it's very little. But the way we are going to be operating in these cores, 8 GB is enough. Another thing that you should know is that these companies, NVIDIA, AMD, all these graphics companies, they are out there to get profit. So they use a certain technique that is also used by cameras, camera companies, even mobile phone companies. They produce so much product with so much confusing, conflicting features. You may find sometimes a powerful graphics card is actually cheaper than a less powerful graphics card of the same company. So they use like this kind of strategy where they confuse you with lots and lots of products. They confuse you with lots and lots of advertising. They say this one is good, this one is better, this one is what. So there's usually so much confusion. And sometimes, there's something that is happening right now. It's like we are very hardware frenzy. We didn't have this before. Before, nobody cared what graphics card you're using, but they realized if they were to brand those products and advertise them, people become fans. In my opinion, I think it's insane for you to become a fan of a graphics card brand. Like, I'm a NVIDIA boy, I am a Radeon boy. That's crazy. All you have to care is how does it serve your purpose. It's stupid and insane, in my opinion, to be a fanboy for a graphics card. Very insane. You should care on how it serves your purpose. Now, having that fanaticism, it's actually blinding you from seeing what is really happening. There's something that is called the law of diminishing value. The law of diminishing value, it's essentially, it's like this. I'm going to simplify it by giving an example between Android and iPhones, Android phones and iPhones. So the law of diminishing value says that there's a certain point whereby an increase in price doesn't mean that it's an increase in value. And that is actually very true. You can take a $300 or a $400 Android phone and compare it perhaps with I don't know the price of iPhones, but I'm assuming it's let's say a $1,000 iPhone. If you compare them, of course, maybe the iPhone will be better, but how better is it? And then you compare how better is it. Let's say we give them points. Let's say the best phone in the world has 100 points. Maybe an iPhone will have 90. But that Android phone, which is perhaps even a quarter of the price of the iPhone, will say have 85. So there'll be a difference in 5 quality points, or 5 points in terms of goodness of the product. But the price is going to be phenomenally higher. Yes, in some cases, in terms of graphics card, a $5,000 graphics card proves its worth. But if you're going to buy a $5,000 graphics card, you should make sure that graphics card, when it's in your possession, it can help you produce at least $500,000. And that is what you should have in mind. It's crazy to buy a $2,000 graphics card only so that that graphics card can help you maybe you're making, let's say, $2,000 a month. to $2,200 a month. It's crazy. If you're going to buy a $2,000 graphics card, you should make sure that it can at least make you $4,000 more every month. Exactly. That is why you come to a point whereby I start defending tiny graphics card like this one. Why? Because in terms of value. Of course, the next graphic card that is actually better than this one may be 4 times its price, or maybe 10 times its price. Of course, this is a very cheap graphics card. This is an $80 graphics card, but the graphics card that is going to be 3 times better than this is going to be $800. You see? So in terms of value. So I'm not saying you shouldn't buy expensive things. I'm saying you should buy expensive things when those expensive things can prove their worth to you and not make you feel good as I have the NVIDIA Titan. You shouldn't buy pride, but buy value, buy worth, buy that tangible worth that it can add to your workflow. So that is all when it comes to computer hardware.